Hi, everyone, and welcome to Generation 180's Electrify Your Ride Week event, Policies Driving EV Adoption Forward. If you're here to learn how thoughtfully crafted policies at all levels of government can help drive EV adoption, then you're in the right place. Today, we're looking forward to hearing from three great panelists, Catherine Stankin from Plug-in America, Karine Dumit from EVgo, and Brendan Kelly from Clean Fuels Ohio. We're thrilled to have such great speakers as our panelists today. Thank you again so much for joining us. Before we get started, I want to tell you briefly about Generation 180. We're a national nonprofit organization based in Charlottesville, Virginia, working to inspire and equip individuals to take action on clean energy. My name is Stuart Gardner, and I'm joined by my colleague Blair St. Ledger Olson. And a special thanks to our team members working behind the scenes to help support this event. Here's a quick look at the three major focus areas of our work. We're working to flip the energy script, helping us move from a narrative on climate doom and gloom to a story focused on where we need to go, a world powered by 100% clean energy, a story that says we can do this and we all have a role to play. We focus on individuals in their homes and communities because your energy matters. Certain behaviors and technologies not only have the power to fight climate change, but they also help build the social momentum and political will we need to get big system-level changes. We lead two major nationwide campaigns, Solar for All Schools, which just released their 2020 Brighter Future report, and Electrify Your Ride, which works to make EVs more accessible. Solar and EVs are clean energy solutions proven to address two of the largest sources of carbon dioxide, emissions from electricity generation and transportation. As part of our Electrify Your Ride campaign, we host educational events like this one, where people can learn more about EVs. This week it's full of online events that are great for EV owners, EV advocates, and the EV curious alike. We have sessions that dive into EV buses, expanding access to EVs, and much, much more. We're even giving away an awesome e-bike. So drop in for a few sessions or stay for them all. It's free and it's open to everyone. A few housekeeping items before we dive in. Because of the large number of people joining us today, all event attendees will remain on mute throughout the event. So please use your Q&A and not the chat to submit any of your questions. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can over the next hour. So without further ado, let's hear from our guests. Catherine, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks to Generation 180 for inviting me here to speak today. My name is Catherine Stankin. I'm the Policy Director with Plug-in America, and we're one of the co-organizers of National Drive Electric Week. So everybody, welcome to the Thursday of National Drive Electric Week. It's been a great week so far. We had a great kickoff, lots of amazing events all around the country, and it's just so exciting to see the momentum build event after event and year after year. I mean, we've been doing these events now. I think this is the I don't know, the 10th? Okay, Blair knows. It's the 10th annual National Drive Electric Week. I should know that, I'm embarrassed. But just seeing the momentum here in terms of EV adoption and then in terms of the events and whatnot, and now we're gonna talk about policy. I mean, it's an amazing week. So definitely blessed to be here. So we can go to the next slide. So Plug-in America, just very briefly, in case you don't know who we are, we're the voice of the EV consumer. We're active in all 50 states and nationwide, although the extent that we're active on the policy issues in that state varies state to state. We try to prioritize certain states where we think it might be a leader to set the stage or set the tone for other states in that region, or where we have a lot of members. There's a lot of different factors that go into deciding what states will be heavily involved in, but we do have drivers in all 50 states. We're a 501c3 nonprofit founded back in 2008, although if you have ever seen the blockbuster movie, Who Killed the Electric Car, or The Revenge of the Electric Car, that's how we got our start. Back in the early 2000s, we were a bunch of very passionate EV drivers that got together, and we were really shaken up by the fact that the California Air Resources Board and some of the automakers were going to recall their EVs. And so they banded together and formed this advocacy group, kind of ad hoc. And over the years, we become now an official 501c3 nonprofit here, advocating for you all, because I saw one of the poll results there. It looked like the majority of you all drive electric. So good job, everyone. We focus on policy and advocacy, which is my wheelhouse. And then we also do a bunch of education and outreach, obviously, NDO and DEED. These are some of our events that we help to co-organize, but then we also run a program called Plug Start, which is our consumer engagement tool, which helps you to select the right EV. And then in some states, it'll also match you up with the correct trained dealer that we train up, and then also loop you back with your utility for any incentives or rebates that they might offer. So let's go to the next slide. So just to, in case there are some of folks on here that aren't aware of just kind of the lay of the land in terms of the EV scene, this is kind of nationwide sales from 2011 until 2020. You can see the big trend up there in 2018. That was because of the release of the Model 3. And maybe not so strong in 2020, obviously because of COVID. But the good news there is that a lot of the global markets are still driving things, you know, behind the scenes in Norway, in China, and whatnot. And so a lot of the automakers are, you know, they're very invested in this. They're very focused on getting their new makes and models out. And so what that means for the United States is that then we're going to see a ton of new makes and models come out over the next few years, which is going to help to drive forward the policy and make our policy arguments even stronger. So let's go to the next slide. So I love to be working at the federal level on policy, because policy is so important. It just kind of lays that marker. It lays down that signal for where we're going. And so things that happen at the federal level can really set the tone for then what happens at the state level, what happens on a regional basis, what happens then at the local level and the city level too. Not always, as we've seen, you know, with this past administration, they haven't been particularly favorable towards electric vehicles, but we are hoping for a shift coming soon, and some really supportive EV policies. So just a couple markers here to show where we've been this past year, because that'll set the tone for where we're going in 2021. This past summer, we saw the passage of the Moving America Forward Act on the House side, and it didn't pass the Senate, obviously. Otherwise, we'd be celebrating up the, we'd be really celebrating this end.
We'd be doing cartwheels.
Yeah, we'd be doing cartwheels. Exactly. But this is a good indication of what we might see going forward, going into next year. And I've been doing federal level EV work now for 4.5 years. And I can tell you that over the years now, and when I started, nobody knew what an electric vehicle was. There was very few people, only a few were that outcast that drove EVs, but now everybody knows what an EV is. And they know that it's also not a Toyota Prius. They might not know exactly that there's the Prius Prime, but they know that we're not talking about hybrids anymore. We're talking about plug-in electric vehicles. And so their education level has increased. They're not only looking at policies like the federal tax credit, which we are huge supporters of, and which was included in that Moving Forward America Act, but they're looking at now other policies about infrastructure, policies about things we can do for underserved communities, policies to electrify the federal fleet, the postal service, all kinds of things. And so in that Moving America Forward Act, there was so many policies that were presented and discussed. And so that's going to be a marker that drives us forward into 2021, hopefully. But go back, sorry. Just another quick note there about a battery policy. So some of you might be getting questions as you're doing your outreach in terms of the batteries and what's in place for that. And I would encourage you to look at this S3356. The Battery and Critical Mineral Recycling Act of 2020, and we're hoping that that'll see passage, because we do need to be looking longer term out towards how we're going to be recycling batteries after their second use, third use, etc. But that would start the conversation on that. And Plug in America has also been educating senators and representatives by doing ride and drives on Capitol Hill. Just a couple quick things here about agencies. So obviously we've seen a lot of activity from the EPA and NHTSA, unfortunately, with their reopening of the midterm evaluation of the fuel efficiency standards. And then they came up with their proposed rule in place of that. And then they came up with their final rules. And all of that you can just effectively, you can call the Clean Cars program. And I'm sure you're all aware that there are lawsuits now for each of those various parts of those rules there. From the reopening, there's lawsuits going on from the final rule part 1 and the final rule part 2. And we are anticipating, that lawsuit will be ruled in our favor eventually. Whether that happens in 2021 or 2022, that's remains to be seen a little bit now. But eventually, we are anticipating that that it'll be ruled in our favor. Another thing there, the Federal Transit Administration, the Low No Emission Vehicle Program. This is for transit buses and infrastructure. We saw some funding for that over the previous years, but hopefully we'll continue to see more funding for that. And then with the Department of Energy, they still have some battery R&D programs, and we're hoping that we'll see a comeback of the the DOE's Workplace Charging Challenge program, and there's a couple other things that are kind of just lurking in the weeds there at the Department of Energy. And the White House, we'll just skip that in the interest of time. Let's go to the next slide. So Plug in America, so beyond the federal level though, we're also active at the, the state level and the cities level, and local levels, also the legislative side and the regulatory side. So we worked with the Sierra Club, Electrification Coalition, and Forth to put together our Achieve Model Policy Toolkit. And what this is a menu of options for various different stakeholders. So this will all be very helpful for you as a big takeaway from today's session, that if you are talking to your city officials or your transit agencies or other businesses, and they are excited about electric vehicles and they want to know what they can do in terms of the policies or programs, you can point them to this toolkit and say, well, here's options A, B, C, D, etc. And you can see on our slide there, we have that the toolkit goes into categories of the policies as well, in terms of enabling the vehicle purchase, things to do for infrastructure, how to prioritize equity, how to electrify your fleet, and more. Next slide. I better wrap it up here so we get to the other speakers. Sorry, this is just a quick little snapshot there of some of the local level policies, but we'll get into that in a discussion. So next slide. I think it might be it. Yep, that's it. Okay.
That's awesome. Catherine, we'll definitely have a lot of follow-up questions on that. Corinne, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about EVgo and some of the work you do?
Yeah, sure. What a great segue, Catherine. First of all, thank you so much for Generation 180. Thank you, Blair, and thank you, Stuart, for having us. Really pleased to be participating in this panel, and it's a very exciting week, even if we're doing this virtually this year. But so a little bit about EVgo. I thought I'd just mention a little bit about what we're doing. So I am the director of market development and public policy for EVgo for the Eastern US. So that means that I engage with policymakers, state agencies, regulators, utilities, and other partners in this really broad ecosystem of stakeholders to advance transportation electrification and to advance particularly the development of charging networks across the various states on the in the eastern part of the US. We're EVgo is the nation's largest fast charging network for electric vehicles, and actually the first one to be powered by 100% renewable energy. We have more than 800 fast charging locations spread out across 600 cities across 34 states. So and there are different business models in the EV charging world, but we own and operate the charger. We're an owner-operator, and we serve more than 200 customers. We were founded in 2010, and our business is around really convenient metropolitan fast charging. So you'll see us around retail outlets, grocery shops, community locations around urban and suburban populations. And those are as important as charging along highway and transit corridors. And that's because as charging is integrated into everyday activities, that helps with the transition to an EV, and so that becomes more seamless. And as battery electric vehicle density increases, and as EVgo strives to achieve its goal for market expansion, we're steadily able to serve less denser areas. So as I've mentioned, we're partnering with automakers, fleets, rideshare operators, retail hosts like hotels, shopping centers, gas stations, etc., to really expand the availability and make it easier for drivers to take advantage of the benefits of electric vehicles. I will highlight a couple of things that I think would be really interesting for folks to hear. Is that while we are working hard to provide fast and convenient charging for personal use drivers, we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years an increase that shows that DC fast charging also serves well rideshare and car share applications. So DC fast charging which is what we focus on, has been very helpful to provide charging for folks who may not have access to a dedicated parking garage, particularly folks who live in apartment complex, in apartment buildings. But more and more we're seeing drivers of rideshare and car share applications rely on our network because that provides a quick and fast charging that most of the time you'll see located around there, around areas of, retail and restaurants that sort of aligns with, breaks that, a rideshare driver may want to take to get back on the road. And so historically, 1/3 of the electricity or the kilowatt hours used on our network came from these rideshare and car share applications. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think in terms of policies, and I know we'll dive into some of those details in a little bit, and I think Catherine mentioned in her last slide a few of them, if folks kind of got a glimpse of it. But I think with DCFC, I want to sort of highlight a couple of things. First and foremost, I think on the regulatory side of things, rate design and rate reform continues to be a key challenge. And so when you look at how to design programs that encourage the development of charging infrastructure, it's important to look at it in a holistic manner and make sure that you've got the right building blocks. And one of those building blocks is the tariffs. It's as important as the programs that are in place to support the infrastructure itself, like utility make-ready programs, which are investment in the sort of infrastructure that gets a site ready up to be electrified. And so demand charges and rate reform are really central to a lot of the discussions around how can utilities support and sort of work hand in glove with market participants in making sure that we've got the right building blocks to the development of the network. One other thing I'll just mention, just talking about the role of the utilities, it's also important to address soft costs, so streamlining timelines and processes and providing information like hosting capacity maps. Those are all really important tools in the toolbox. And I think that while there is also an important focus on the role of the utilities, it's also important to remember that state energy offices have played a critical role in charging infrastructure development. Here in Virginia, we've partnered with the Virginia DEQ to deploy the state's charging network, fast charging network, and really proud of that effort. But we've also worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Colorado Energy Office, the California Energy Commission, and many more to really grow that network, and we continue to do a lot of effort there. I think I'll kind of stop there and
That's
just
awesome.
kind of leave the rest for the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Brendan, you want to round us out, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about some of your work and the work of Clean Fuels Ohio?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks. I want to echo the other panelists. Thanks to Generation 180, Blair and Stuart, for inviting me to be part of this. My apologies if I'm yawning. My toddler has been up in the middle of the night a lot the past several days, which means I've been up in the middle of the night a lot the past several days. So please
we
excuse
won't take that
this.
personally.
Yeah, I'm very excited about the topic. That's why I'm here. So it's always good to be part of the Catherine Stankin Show. So my name is Brendan Kelly. I am the director of the Drive Electric Ohio initiative at Clean Fuels Ohio. Next slide, please. So first, a little bit about Clean Fuels Ohio as an organization. We are the trusted advisor and collective voice of Ohio's clean transportation industry. Click, please. We are the only U.S. Department of Energy Clean Cities Coalition in Ohio, so we cover the whole state. That gives us strategic relationships with the network of energy laboratories that are part of the Department of Energy, as well as access to resources from the department itself. As an organization, we are fuel and technology neutral, so we will work on the deployment of any kind of vehicle that that runs on something cleaner than petroleum. The core, kind of the bread and butter historically of what we've done, we were founded in 2001, so we're 19 years old as a nonprofit. The core of what we've done historically has been fleet services and consulting, working with public and private fleets all over the state of Ohio to examine the vehicles in their fleet that are conventionally fueled, figure out which alternative fuels vehicles are commercially viable, that can replace conventionally fueled vehicles. We've had a really pragmatic focus on not just helping these fleets to reduce their environmental impact, but also to help them achieve a financial return on investment, generally within 3 to 5 years, because a lot of these alternative fuels vehicles have lower maintenance costs and lower fuel costs than conventionally fueled vehicles. And that pragmatism has allowed us to get entities that don't care about their carbon footprint to shrink their carbon footprint. And then, of course, because you can't just drive up to most gas stations and plug in or refill your alternative fuels vehicle, we work on refueling infrastructure. And finally, because so much of this is dictated by or influenced by policy, we do a lot of policymaker education around all of the different fuel types that we as an organization work on. So then the Drive Electric Ohio. So the Drive Electric Ohio initiative is our comprehensive approach to accelerating electric vehicle adoption across the state. And you hear about Ohio and you don't necessarily think about electric vehicles or environmental policy necessarily. But we're a huge state. We have over 13 million registered vehicles in Ohio, and with transportation being the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, we can't afford to just leave Ohio behind. And there are and the other states that are like Ohio. I mean, it's great that that more progressive states, largely on the coasts, are passing ZEV policies. And California is doing everything California is doing, and that's fantastic. But what works there isn't necessarily going to work in Ohio and states like Ohio. And so what we are working on is developing a model for how do you accelerate electric vehicle adoption in some of these states that are not as politically progressive. So there are 7 components to our 7 kind of pillars of the Drive Electric Ohio initiative. There's a question, Lordstown Motors is in Ohio. Yes, it is, and I will get to that. We are very excited about Lordstown Motors. So the first is grassroots-driven consumer education. So there are, as I think most of the folks on this call know, given how many people are currently driving an EV or thinking about driving an EV for the next car, so much of this is just understanding and getting people to understand how great electric vehicles already are, how affordable they are, how much of a superior vehicle they are compared to conventionally fueled vehicles. But we also don't have a huge staff capacity. We are kind of a small and scrappy nonprofit, although growing rapidly. And so we've applied an organizing model where we, to our consumer education work, where we have chapters of electric vehicle owners and enthusiasts around the state, and we mobilize them when there's not a pandemic to do ride and drives. And that gives us a tremendous amount of reach beyond what our paid staff capacity would allow us to do. The next pillar is local, state, and federal policymaker education. We certainly get involved in federal policymaker education, generally as part of larger coalitions. The bulk of our policy work is the local and state level. The grassroots consumer education actually feeds into that, because that means that we generally are connected to EV owners and enthusiasts who are in every district and every community across the state. And so we can recruit messengers who are constituents of the policymakers that we are working to educate. State policy, so this is where Lordstown Motors becomes really helpful. We certainly have progressive policymakers in Ohio who are motivated by climate change and are motivated by clean air and so on, and that's great. Those folks are already with us. We're really excited about them and really grateful to them for their support. And that is not the majority of policymakers, certainly at the state level in Ohio. And so we've had to figure out, how do we get these folks on board if they are not motivated by climate change. And what we found is Ohio is an auto manufacturing state. We have over 108,000 jobs in auto manufacturing in Ohio. It's a pillar of our economy. And what we've heard from vehicle manufacturers is that, as they are investing hundreds of billions of dollars to shift their production to electric vehicle manufacturing, one of the major factors they're looking for when they make their decisions about where they're siting their new production capacity is, where is there a local market? And so while Ohio, as an auto manufacturing state with our historic competencies, we are a place that it makes sense for those jobs to go, that will, if we put up a sign that says EV is not welcome in Ohio, those jobs will go elsewhere. And so by going, every politician loves auto manufacturing. Every politician loves manufacturing jobs. And so by connecting support for EVs with the future of Ohio's manufacturing industry, we are able to have a really broad base of support across the political spectrum. And then with local policy, we have found that local policymakers can do a lot. They all have fleets that they can electrify. They can deploy public chargers. They can make sure that there are building codes. That Catherine had that list of about 20 different things that policymakers can do at the local level. They also are the folks who most frequently run for state and federal offices. And so if you can get them working on policy early in their careers, they will then be champions at higher levels when they run. And we found that local policymakers are generally less ideological and more pragmatic than state and federal policymakers because they're closer to their budgets, they're closer to their constituents. So if you go to a conservative mayor and say, look, these electric vehicles are going to save you taxpayer dollars, they'll go, oh, great, I love saving taxpayer dollars. Help me electrify my fleet. Next, please. I'll go through the rest of these more quickly. We do a lot of work with electric utilities, co-ops, and regulators. All 4 of Ohio's investor-owned utilities are supportive of electric vehicle adoption, and they all have programs that have either been implemented, are currently in front of the commission, or are in design. Also, our electric co-ops, which serve about 1 million Ohioans, are very excited about electric vehicle adoption and are taking steps there. And our Public Utilities Commission is largely supportive of electric vehicle adoption and understands the broad societal benefits that come to everybody, not just EV owners, when you have widespread adoption. EVSE infrastructure development, obviously that's a key part of it. Clean Fuels Ohio just co-authored a study with the Ohio Department of Transportation, analyzing our gaps in fast charging infrastructure. Dealerships are a huge piece of the puzzle if no one's selling EVs and they can't get on the road. And so we do a lot of work training dealerships. And then also one of the problems we have in Ohio is inventory and model availability. Because we're not a ZEV state, we're lower on the priority list right now for vehicle manufacturers. And so, but we're working to help tell the story of all of the many, many things that are happening in Ohio to support EV adoption, to work on addressing that. Fleet electrification, again, going back to our bread and butter of analyzing fleets and working with them on deployment calendars. And then both as its own pillar and underlying everything we do is ensuring equity and access, because there are significant benefits in communities that have electric vehicle adoption and for people who have access to electrified transportation. But it's important for a variety of reasons to make sure that those benefits are shared across all types of communities. And so we have several projects in low income, rural, and urban communities looking at how do we electrify transportation outside of places where people are just buying expensive new cars. And that's who we are in a large nutshell.
That's awesome. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you guys so much for all of that. I think what all of our participants just heard was a really good level set for not only the work that's being done at all levels of government by your fantastic groups, but really what policies we've been tackling thus far. And the conversation we want to have now is really, where do we need to go? So, Catherine, I think I want to start with you. You mentioned the federal tax credit. It was largely responsible for supporting EV adoption really over the past decade. And as we know, Congress unfortunately declined to extend that policy last year. So how does federal policy need to evolve then to continue accelerating EV adoption?
Question. First of all, the tax credit, we definitely want to continue to extend that and make the tax credit work for more drivers for a longer period of time. And then there's a policy out there too, the used EV tax credit. But really that gets to the point of purchase incentives, and which gets to the point of then stimulating the market more and just, again, kind of laying that signal. So I'm just gonna toss it out there. How about a national ZEV mandate, a national ZEV policy where we are saying that, you know, by X date, you know, we want to see this many EVs on the road, or we want to see, you know, there's a lot of different ways to frame that or shape that, but we could also set that national goal of, like California just did about gas cars and the sales and phase out of that, or we could see other policies in terms of trading in your old ones for the new ones, the cash for clunker type policy. And I know that the Biden administration has expressed, sorry, I jumped the gun there on administration, the Biden policy team, whatever, they've expressed interest in that. So there's other big overarching policies there that, like a carbon tax, I mean, a low carbon fuel standard policy, things like that, that's the direction we need to go in now. We need to move kind of more aggressively forward in that direction. So maybe I'll just pause there.
Just to follow up, you mentioned, you know, the ZEV mandate, advanced clean cars, just to level set. Can you explain what that is and how that makes a difference in, say, states that haven't adopted that, just when you go to your dealership and see on the lot what's available? What's the relationship between those two?
Sure. So I think Brendan was getting at it a little bit, but that ZEV policy there, the program there, it kind of increases the choice for consumers, the stock on the lots, so to speak. So the availability of the makes and models. And so there are, and that's one piece of the Advanced Clean Cars program, which by the Clean Air Act, there's a section of that allows states to kind of go beyond the threshold of standard in terms of the greenhouse gas emission reduction and just setting their own air quality piece of that. And that's summing it up in a nutshell, but it's much more complicated than that. But as a part of that Advanced Clean Car program, there's two parts of that. There's the LEV piece, the low emission vehicle piece, and then there's the ZEV piece, the zero emission vehicle piece. And so when we talk about that ZEV standard or mandate, we're kind of referring back to this larger overall Advanced Clean Car program.
That's great. All right, Brendan, I think this one's going to be for you. As Catherine mentioned earlier, you know, we do have a current legal battle around ZEV, but let's all send happy thoughts into the universe and assume that ZEV is going to remain a viable policy moving forward. But I know from experience that that level of policy, Perry's joining us, sorry y'all. I know from experience that that level of policy is hard to get adopted, and even once it is adopted, it can take time to implement. So does that mean that if you're not a ZEV state, you don't get to participate in the transition to EVs?
So I'll tackle this question first, and then if Perry has any thoughts to add, I'll defer to him.
Perry,
so the answer is no. You don't have to be a ZEV state to participate in transportation electrification. You know, as I mentioned in my introduction, we are working to build a model for how do you accelerate electric vehicle adoption in states that are unlikely to pass a ZEV policy. And there are a number of pieces to that. I mean, first of all, these are just better cars. They're more affordable. And increasingly more affordable. They are cleaner, they are more fun, if you've ever gotten behind the wheel of one. And so, you know, just by creating market demand for these vehicles, we don't necessarily need policy. And increasingly, especially as we get to that inflection point, which is generally projected to be around 2024, where battery prices will go down such that the upfront cost for gas vehicles and electric vehicles will be at parity, will be the same. And we're already at a lower total cost of ownership because electric cars have a lower fuel cost and also much lower maintenance costs. An electric motor has about 1/100th the number of moving parts of a gas motor, just fewer things to break. So sorry, I'm going into my consumer education spiel. Just by building out a market, we can work to address this stuff. But then you also bring in large-scale investment from utilities. You know, most of the trends in electricity use over the past, you know, many years are flat or down. The electrification of transportation is one of the major opportunities for utilities to grow their market sales. I mean, an EV uses about as much electricity as a house. And so the utilities have a huge stake in supporting electric vehicle adoption, and they have lots and lots of money they can invest in this. That's why, for example, in Ohio, either in place or proposed, we have more than, I want to say it's $35 million in investment in EV infrastructure and support for EVs just from utilities. And so you can, and then we have the $11.25 million from a Volkswagen settlement program, for EV charging and so on. So there are a number of ways to bring in resources, ways to encourage people to buy EVs that are outside of having a ZEV policy. All hope is not lost.
Excellent. That's the message we needed to hear.
And now I'll toss it to Perry.
Smush. No.
A lot of time when we talk about policies to increase EV adoption, common ones are, of course, the tax credit and, like retail level incentives. How do you guys respond to people that say, hey, we shouldn't be supporting an industry if it can't survive on its own? I'd like to hear each of your perspectives. How do you respond to that kind of comment? Corinne, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think that, first of all, I think that the transition to electric vehicle is happening, and it's happening in a multi-pronged approach. You've got a lot of effort being put in to increase EV adoption. And I think to use a common term that we've always said is like, it's peanut butter and jelly, right? So EV adoption as well as the infrastructure really have to go hand in glove. And I really think that at the state level, at least from my perspective here on the East Coast, and I think I can give an example of what's going on in Virginia or even in New Jersey, just two different states and a different approach there. But essentially, these are all suites of different initiatives and policies that together really leverage one another's efforts. So, for example, you've got VW settlement funding that is being that is currently that some of it has been deployed and others is in the process of it. But what really leverages that utility investments in make ready and tariff reforms, all of those things help continue to sort of put the path forward for a sustainable, robust industry. And I think that there's a lot of, like, we see the demand for these products. We see the demand for electric vehicles. We're actually building ahead of that demand, and I think that there's a lot more work. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work that already has been done and needs to continue.
Catherine, you have an opinion on that about if someone says, why are we supporting an industry if it can't live on its own?
Well, I would flip that back on its head to you, Stuart. And
there we go.
What industry is getting support? I mean, in the clean energy world and the EV world, we're always talking about the subsidies to, oil and gas industries, but even Hollywood gets tax breaks. I mean, there's farmers get subsidies. I mean, to name me an industry that doesn't get that support. Yeah. I think maybe in terms of the purchase incentive, people are starting to hamper down on that because on the one hand, we are expecting that price parity with the gas vehicles, around 2024, 2025, as Brendan was saying. But then, so why do we still, if we're expecting that, why do we still need the purchase incentive? But to give consumers that opportunity, because the cars are a larger purchase experience, they're a larger purchase, and then we want them to experience driving electric. And we won't be needing these incentives on the purchase side for forever. But for right now, policies are needed to sometimes kickstart the market and drive us forward in a certain direction. And so, drive forward.
Yeah.
That's great. Brendan, anything to add on that?
Yeah, there are three really big reasons why it is important to support the electric vehicle industry. First of all, this is the future of auto manufacturing. Vehicle manufacturers have already committed hundreds of billions of dollars to shifting their production to EVs, and that number goes up rapidly on an almost daily basis. If you look at where those dollars are being invested globally, the United States is currently missing out, and it's because of policy. Vehicle manufacturers want to produce those vehicles where they're going to be sold, and if they're not selling in the United States, they're going to be produced in other countries. And so if we want to continue to be a country that manufactures vehicles, we have to do this, or there's a wave coming, and we can either ride it or be swamped by it. So that's, first of all, the economic piece. Second of all, there are broad societal benefits to accelerating electric vehicle adoption beyond just the EV owners. There's been a lot of studies that have come out recently about the climate and air quality impacts in low-income communities, particularly urban areas. And so if we care about the health and making sure that zip code is not a determinant of health, it's important to address air quality through transportation. Also, there's some studies that have come out of the 2 utility service territories that have the highest electric vehicle adoption, both in California, that prove what was only previously projected, where if you have a good program to manage EV charging at even relatively low rates, like high single digits of adoption and market penetration, you will start to see a downward pressure on electricity rates for all ratepayers. And so literally everybody that buys electricity is going to pay less, because EV owners are helping to bring down the cost of electricity for everybody. And the final reason is climate. I mean, the projections for 2070, if we don't do something, are catastrophic. 2070 may seem really far off. My toddler is going to be 52 years old. My child is going to be 52 years old in 2070. That's not old. I might even have, young adult children and grandchildren by that point. And so heck, I would be 86, so I might even still be alive. I mean, for those of us, we are living in a time when we will see, and certainly our children will see, the planet burn if we don't do something. And so this is urgent, and it is needed. And so people that don't think we should support this industry need to stop being so short-sighted.
I would actually agree with. Sorry, I was going to ask one thing about what Brendan said in terms of EV load being beneficial load.
I was literally going to ask you to follow up on that. So yeah, go.
No, I mean, nothing more. He said it perfectly well. EV loads are beneficial load. And I think you'll see that sort of end up being, you'll see those over time as more and more EV sort of get utilized, those the charging stations on the grid. But the other thing I was going to mention is that, if anything, the COVID crisis really highlighted the link between environmental health, economic health, and social health,
air quality,
and public health. It's really, it's really so important, and especially right now, what's going on in California, air quality levels are terrible, and so if anything, it's that we need to make sure that, I think that policies provide the right indication of where we want to go, and if that's the direction that we want to go, then we should all really put our heads together and try to figure out how we get there. And so it's if anything, it's only more and more urgent now.
Yeah. And I think you all just brought up 2 really, really good points, both that we see pushback a lot. If you spend any time looking at Facebook comments, I don't recommend it. We see people say, well, but if everybody drives an electric vehicle, the California grid will crash. Just no. Collectively, no. As long as we are thoughtful and we use managed charging and the right rate designs, it's the opposite. The EVs can really help support grid stabilization instead. And the second point that I want to highlight, Brendan, the climate reality of this, and it's not really just for our children. It's happening now for so many communities. I mean, just look at the West Coast and the issues that we're having with extended fire seasons and extreme weather. I mean, especially when you're combining extreme weather events, in particular hurricane season, with COVID at the same time, with our air quality impacts, it's never been more front and center in our minds from my perspective. But so, that's the environmental scientist in me, had to make that rant. Don't mind me. But, I think, Brendan, you brought it up earlier too, in that mentioning Lordstown, and we're getting left behind, and how arguments are being made for incentifying EVs, not just from an environmental perspective, but also the job markets, and particularly from a a Midwestern state, it's great to see Ohio being a leader in that space. And how do you leverage that argument when you're speaking with policymakers?
Well, we certainly know a lot about this stuff at Clean Fuels Ohio, but we also know we're not necessarily the best messengers. And so part of what we do is we serve as, like I said, we're the voice of Ohio's clean transportation industry. We do a lot of the kind of policy research and development of compelling arguments and all, and then recruiting people like Lordstown Motors. I mean, I've lost count of the number of times we've been at press conferences or in meetings with Steve Burns, the CEO of Lordstown Motors, because he's a really strong messenger. I mean, he can literally say, GM abandoned this plant, or they closed it down. And then we came in and we restored those manufacturing jobs. And everybody loves manufacturing jobs, and everybody gets the argument. I mean, it's not
Right.
It's not like it's we don't have to get deep into the science that loses people. It's, if you want to have manufacturing jobs, you have to buy products that are manufactured, and so it's pretty compelling and resonant, and like I said, not overly digging into the science. And then we recruit them and train them to be messengers, and then put them in front of policymakers. I mean, we had a Lordstown Endurance, one of their pickups, at the Ohio State House.
I saw that picture.
And we had Republicans and Democrats, current office holders, candidates, and legislative staff getting in and taking pictures with it. They're really excited about it. I mean, our Republican governor, is thinking about buying an electric Jeep, because it's probably going to be made in or at least partly made in Toledo. But also it's going to be really cool. And so, so these vehicles, I mean, the fact that they're really cool and the fact that they are manufactured here, that makes those companies really compelling messengers to policymakers who have a lot of power to influence this one way or another, but who are not necessarily swayed by or influenced by the climate argument.
Right. And Catherine mentioned too, having, ride and drive events at Capitol Hill. I think that's a fantastic method to help drive adoption and awareness.
We've heard some examples of policies that are, that help support EVs. What about policies that create a barrier for EV adoption? Anything come to mind you guys want to highlight that's out there that is doing the opposite of creating this momentum? Anyone can take that one?
Sure. Well, we've seen the EV fees pop up, the punitive fees, of course, that's not helpful. And certainly then that opens the door to a larger conversation about how transportation should be funded longer term, how our roads should be funded longer term. And we just hope that policymakers are understanding that this is, and doing our part to educate them, that this is a bigger discussion here, and there are solutions to this. And so in the interim, let's not put something punitive on an EV driver that's going to discourage them from, purchasing the vehicle. Certainly EV drivers should pay their fair share of the roads. We don't disagree with that by any means, but there's definitely more fair ways to do that. And we'd like to see that states are starting to have these conversations about, what is the longer term solution here? Is it a vehicle miles traveled program or something similar? So that's, those EV fees.
That's great.
Not a helpful policy.
Anything to add, Corinne or Brendan?
I was just going to say, and this is applicable for both the EV and the charging space, that if you sort of changed around the question about like what would impede, I think that anything that may perhaps inadvertently or otherwise punish early movers. So as as early movers come in to the market with new products, with new services, with new adoption of vehicles, you want to make sure that programs that are put in place at a later time also take that into account, those early investments, so that you're not inadvertently perhaps punishing early movers or early adopters of specific programs or technologies.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that is we have a burdensome and excessive, deliberately burdensome and excessive EV fee in Ohio, and we are mobilizing to scale that back to something that is fair. As Catherine said, EV owners want to pay their fair share. we all know we use the roads. We all know we put wear and tear on them. We all know it's our responsibility to pay for them. But it's also important that the level of contribution that all drivers put in is fair and commensurate to the amount that they actually drive. And so, these EV fees are a tactic by those who oppose EV adoption to try and slow it down or make it stop. And it's a powerful and effective tool in their toolbox. And we are organizing to fight that in Ohio. So if you're watching this and you're in Ohio, reach out to us and get involved in that fight.
And Brendan, remind me, how expensive is that fee right now in Ohio?
Ohio is $200 a year for anything with a plug, so both plug-in all electrics and plug-in hybrids, and then $100 a year for non-plug-in hybrids.
And what is it for a normal car?
Regardless of how many miles you drive.
Regardless of how many miles. Ohio, if you don't drive an electric vehicle, or if you drive some kind of hybrid that uses gas, we have a gas tax. And so most of our roads are funded through a per gallon tax. We can get into all kinds of arguments about the fairness and structure of tax policy. I'll put on my policy wonk hat, but that might be outside of what we can handle in 7 minutes.
That's fair.
For the follow-up.
For the follow-up, for everybody listening, when we were discussing what we were going to talk about today, we knew that we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, and that you all might leave us if we did that. So we're not going to as much as we would like to, but we will have follow-up events. But for these last 5 minutes, I want to focus us on, really, I think what in particular Generation 180 and Plug in America are about, as well as Drive Electric Ohio, in that helping people, everyday people, EV owners, EV advocates, play a role in this transition. And Catherine Roberts submitted a question about what we need to do to, myth bust. And I think we had an EV myth busting event on Monday. So we'll release that recording, but I'd love to hear each one of your perspectives on what role everyday EV owners have to play in our transition. And Catherine, I think we'll start with you.
Oh man, how am I supposed to limit this just to 5 minutes now?
I know.
Gosh, well, that's a great question. And the EV drivers are the best mouthpieces for electric vehicles. And to do some of that myth busting, I would really encourage you to reach out to your city council members, to business owners, to state policymakers, and do ride and drives for them, and reach out to us. We're happy to help with that, or reach out to Clean Fuels Ohio for Ohio, Gen 80 for the states that you guys are active in too. That is really the best. But I have seen so many policymakers be like, oh, I thought I was about to step into a golf cart, or I thought that this would be much more complicated, or like, oh, it actually does drive. That is the biggest way to do a lot of myth busting. And then, you supplement that with then some fact sheet material, and just keep the conversation going. And to really create change, you just stay in their face. All politicians, their business model is to get reelected in however long their cycle is, 4 years for most of them. And so they want to be representing you well. That's why for most of them, they chose to be a politician, and then maybe they get sucked into other interests and whatnot, but their business model is to get reelected. So stay in their face and show them your EV.
Corinne, do you want to go next?
Yeah, education and awareness. More education and awareness. And I think that, I'll give an example in the space of like ride sharing and car sharing, right? So if you're not an EV driver and you get into an Uber or a Lyft, and that's in an EV vehicle, that's you get exposed to that. You see how it is. You get that experience, and I think all of those things are one of the many tools that helps again showcase that these things are here. They're right there. It's not something that's happening in the future. And so continue to share your experience. Continue to educate and talk to different folks about your experience and about what driving an EV and utilizing an EV has been.
Brendan, can you bring us home?
Sure. And so I would just say, that having an EV owner be the messenger on this is really powerful, because when they can say, here's what I do every day with my EV, then the myths fall away, because they just do. You know, I mean, for example, I was talking to one of our Drive Electric chapter members in the Dayton area who's saying, you know, I'm retired, I'm on a fixed income. I live in a rural township outside of Dayton. I bought a used Nissan Leaf to save myself money. I've got 101 miles of range in the summer and 85 miles of range in the winter. I've had it for over a year. I have no public charging near me. I just charge in my garage, and it's been wonderful. We've saved a ton of money. We actually drive it more than my husband's pickup truck, you know, unless we're going on a really long distance. And for her to go in and say that, what are the people who peddle false information going to say? No, right. What you've been doing for the past year isn't real. You know, and then the other thing is ride and drives are really powerful. There is nothing like the visceral experience of getting behind the wheel of an EV, putting your foot on the accelerator and going fast off the block. Right. There's a noise that people make the first time they feel the acceleration of an EV, and hearing that come out of the mouths of policymakers is one of my favorite sounds in the entire world. And also getting them involved in those ride and drives, that gives the ability, you know, to facilitate conversations between EV owners and the policymakers, so that not only do they have those individual conversations, they can do some relationship building, and so you can the constituents that are EV owners can follow up with the policymakers. So EV owners are a huge piece of that.
That's fantastic. And also that is going to be my new favorite noise as well. I can't wait. Well, it is 12:59, so we want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know there are a lot of questions in the Q&A that we were not able to get to. Again, we could talk about this for days, but there will be a recording posted of this event, and we do save all of the questions, and we will try to get to them, whether or not it's through direct contact, or it's through a blog post, or it's through an entire policy series, because maybe that's what it'll take. We're going to make sure we try to address all of these questions. And really, truly, if you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to reach out to any of us. We're really here to help. So thank you, guys. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. This has been so much fun and too short.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for having us. Everybody wear a mask. Stay safe and
Have
healthy.
a good weekend. Yes.
Stay
Bye
safe,
all.
everybody.
Thank you.